And now on Radio Lou, we head over to No Man's Land, and Jenny Alsop is going to read us a poem about her cafe on the harbour side in Lou.
A while back, when I was an active part of the Lou Writers Group, we were asked to compose a poem in the style of Charles Causley, whose 100th anniversary it was. And I struggled for a bit, and they always say, write what you know, so I wrote what I know. And this is the result. It's called The Cafe Owner's Dilemma. A party of 20 for afternoon tea. That was every available table. The booking was taken with absolute glee. We'd better call in waitress Mabel. There'd be sandwiches fine and tea in a pot, and finger rolls fresh from the oven. The finest cream tea would be finished off with cakes dainties and sponge by the dozen. Ham and mustard on white, smoked salmon on brown. Better put in some cucumber. Rare roast beef, do you think, or egg mayonnaise? The possibilities are without number. Victoria sponge all dusted with sugar. Fluffy scones with the jam always first, topped with thick clotted cream and a strawberry on top. Eclairs with creme pat fit to burst. Pear and frangipane tart, brownies gooey and rich. Mini muffins with Morello cherries, with white chocolate chips, crusted sugar on top, and a cheesecake stuffed with blueberries. Darjeeling, Earl Grey, served with lemon or milk, or some coffee if they prefer. A glass of Prosecco would be rather nice. Perhaps we should play that by ear. And pots for the tea. Should we buy in some more? And some 3-tiered stands for the cake? We've enough cake forks, knives, cups, saucers and plates. A splendid impression we'll make. The telephone rings. It's the lady who booked. With regards to my reservation, can you offer a menu that would fit the bill for some with food intoleration? We'd all like to share in the afternoon tea, but first I'd like to confide that 3 of our group vegetarians are, and no shellfish or caffeine for 5. Gluten intolerance is suffered by 4. A further 2 are strict dairy-free. In addition to this, there is also 1 with a quite nasty fish allergy. 1 more suspects that she cannot eat eggs. It's something she read on the net. And lactose intolerant are further 2, which is often a problem you get. I'm sure that you know that our vegan cannot eat eggs, butter, milk, shellfish or cheese. Also not fish, absolutely no meat. But you'll surmount these small problems with ease. Nut allergies are quite common these days, but I should make it perfectly clear that your kitchen should be a complete nut-free zone, so our 2 friends could eat without fear. I listened, digested, and then made some notes regarding the proposed awkward order. I've given it thought, I've consulted my books. I can offer you rice cakes and water. The end.
Wasn't that wonderful? Now Jenny reads another one of her compositions, The Price of Fish.
March 1622. The woman swallowed the lump in her throat and put on her bravest face. The smile that she knew she should show was a little slow in coming, but as she took in the 3 men who waited for her blessing, it finally came, illuminating the plainness of her 44-year-old countenance. Her husband cleared his throat. We'll be back before you know it, Anne, and I'll take good care of the boys. We've got to go. Old Harry won't wait the cart much longer, and it's a fair walk to Plymouth to catch the ship otherwise. Jack was her own age, weathered and whipcord slim still, strong and sinewy. She leaned forward and kissed him, briefly on the cheek. They were not demonstratively affectionate here outside their cottage on the quayside in East Lou. It wouldn't be fitting. and then opened her sturdy arms to embrace the two young men stood to the side of their father. "Ma, we need to be gone." This from the larger of the almost matched pair of young Cornish giants. "Then be gone, all of you," this said with a smile in her voice, "and heed your father, or you'll have me to answer to when you come home in the autumn." The two young men took a place in the back of the laden cart with their small bundles, and Jack pulled himself up next to the old man, who, with a clicking of his tongue and a "Hup now," started the cart on its slow journey to Plymouth. Anne blinked away the tears that filled her eyes. It was not the first time that her husband had departed in the spring, but it was the first time that he had taken their sons, now strapping lads who dwarfed their father at 15 and 17. They had worked hard to become good fishermen, and now the chance to join the fleet headed for the cod fishery off the coast of the New World was one that would secure their futures. There had been 2 other sons and 3 daughters who had not survived beyond infancy, but John and Will had flourished, and she was proud of them. She would go to St Mary's Church on the front and say a prayer for her family. The fleet of ships leaving Plymouth were a motley selection of craft. Jack owed his good fortune to be part of their crews by virtue of a cousin who had moved to Plymouth to work for a boat owner there. Each spring, when the easterlies took over from the prevailing southwesterly winds for a time, the fleet would set sail for the New World. Not to colonise as those poor fools had done in the Mayflower a few years earlier, but to follow the example that the Spanish, French and Portuguese had set for 100 years or more. They were heading for the cod fishery of the Grand Banks, where the fish were so numerous that a man could almost follow in the footsteps of our Lord and walk on the water on the backs of the golden freckled fish. This the tall tale that John and Will were regaled with as they sailed westward on a sturdy carrack. The fleet carried not just fishermen, but a blacksmith, cooks and a score of other men who would process the fish once caught and whose skills were as important as those of the men who caught the fish. They arrived on the shores of Newfoundland after an uneventful passage of many weeks, and once men and supplies were ashore, began the tough preparation of the camp, which would become their home for the months ahead. Day after day, trees were felled, rudimentary cabins built, the blacksmith's forge set up, and the small boats known as dories repaired and made seaworthy once more. 2 men who had overwintered on the coast to guard the camp were overjoyed that once again the fleet had found their way back to the same stretch of coast. They had protected the dories, but the appalling winter weather had, as usual, left little of the stores and cabins from the previous year. As the days grew longer, the camp took shape until all was ready to start fishing. The shoreline was transformed. Where once the slow-growing spruce had overshadowed the beach, now a small settlement took their place. Sleeping huts, cookhouse, and, outnumbering all the other buildings, storehouses for their catch, and rack upon rack of spruce branches for drying the cod, called flakes. On the first day of June, Jack and John pushed their little dory into the icy water until up to their thighs, and then heaved themselves aboard. "By Christ, but it's cold!" John exclaimed as they settled themselves to the oars and began to row away from shore. His father grinned, glad to be back on the water. "If it wasn't cold, there'd be less cod. They seem to like it cold. Makes them grow bigger than the ones we catch at home." And John soon saw the truth of the remark. They had rowed a few leagues offshore and drifted a while, whilst baiting the iron hooks of their long lines with squid caught the previous night. The hard work began. Time after time they threw the lines over the side of the boat and pulled them back in, 60 yards and more of wet, salty line, and unhooked the flapping, golden-speckled cod, some a full 4 and 5 foot long, and baited the hooks with the squid and threw the line over the side again, until their dory was full and they had barely room to row back to shore. Will was waiting for them when they dragged the dory onto the beach. Other boats were doing the same on either side, and together they unloaded the catch, which Will started to drag up to the flakes. Headers flashed their heavy knives, cutting off the heads, opening the bellies and gutting the great still twitching fish, heaving them towards the splitters, who skilfully filleted them to resemble huge silver-gilt butterflies. And then the salters took charge, laying the cod over the flakes to begin the painstaking process of salting and drying in the sun and the air, turning their charges to ensure an even cure, and covering them to protect them when it rained. And so it continued through the long calm days of the summer, day in, day out. Catch, head, gut, split, salt, dry. Catch, head, gut, split, salt, dry. And then it was September. The fish rooms were full, the winds were fair and blowing from the west, and soon the ice would come. It was time to go home. They loaded the ships with the barrels of salted cured cod, secure in the knowledge that it had been a good season. The quality was the best they could achieve, the prices would be good. Jack! Jack turned. The captain of the smallest carrack was gesturing him over. My mate has died of a putrid fever. Will you take his place on the return trip? There'll be an extra share for you when we get home. Jack thought for a moment. He recognised the skipper from Plymouth and knew him to be a fair man. The boys were together on the biggest of the vessels, but could be trusted to follow orders. They'd grown into proper men this summer, hard-working and reliable. He nodded. I'll get my bundle and have a word with the boys and be right with you. The return voyage was straightforward. Good, strong southwesterly winds pushed them effortlessly eastward towards Plymouth, and with the exception of a vicious squall in the Bay of Biscay, which scattered the fleet a little, was uneventful. The boys arrived in the bustling port of Plymouth and watched, slightly overwhelmed, the furore as the numerous fish merchants from all over Europe bid for the barrels of salt cod being landed by the multitude of ships. After a few days, all of the migrant fishing fleet had returned, landed their fish and been paid off, bar one. The smallest carrack had failed to make port. John and Will waited day by day on the harbour side, taking turns to visit the boat owner's house to make inquiries, and spending restless nights on the floor of their cousin's store nearby. A further week passed, and the factor came to find them. I'm sorry, boys. He handed them a bag of coins. This is your father's share. Best you go home now and break the news to your mother. The Good Companion must have foundered in the squall, or she'd have been back by now, and we must account her lost. There's a cart going back your way, and nothing to be gained by waiting any longer. The boys walked along the quay, and there was old Harry in his cart. They pulled themselves disconsolately onto the back of the wagon bed. It was scarcely the homecoming they had envisioned 6 months earlier. Anne had been expecting the return of her menfolk for several weeks. She noted the winds and weather and knew that they would be home soon. It was late afternoon, and the sun that streamed in through the small windows in the house on the quay would soon disappear behind the hills of West Loo. She raised her head from the mending in her lap as she heard the footsteps below, went to the head of the stairs and called down, "Lo?" A smile broke across her face as she saw her boys coming in, and faded as she realised there were but two. She peered past them. "Jack?" and looked at their faces, and knew the answer to her inquiry, and knew they were struggling to frame the words that would explain her husband's absence. There would be no funeral. There was no body. She felt an incomplete loss. Mayhap he survived on the rocky shores of northern Spain or Brittany, maybe taken by pirates, perhaps picked up by another ship heading for the New World. And so every day as the sun began its dip below the hills of West Loo, she would walk to the church on the front, and with the sound of the sea breaking on the shore just yards away, say a prayer for the return of her man. And then she would go down onto the beach, climb the groyne that separated the beach from the river, and like generations of women before her, and all of those that would follow, she would stare out past the island, waiting and hoping that her man would one day come home.